They say every cursed object has a point of origin, a single moment in time when something human brushes too close to something inhuman. But the story of the Dybbuk Box doesn't begin with spirits or rituals. It begins with something much more ordinary, an estate sale, a quiet house, and the kind of silence that feels like it's waiting for someone to ask the wrong question. The house sat on a nondescript street in Portland, Oregon, the sort of place neighbors forget about until the lawn grows long and the mail spills out onto the porch. The woman who lived there had died only weeks before, a Holocaust survivor, one of the few who spoke rarely about what she endured, and even less about what she brought with her when she fled Europe. Estate liquidators moved quietly through the rooms, tagging items, assigning prices, and placing objects onto tables under the glow of old lamps. Most objects, porcelain figures, wedding photographs, kitchen tools, inherited the calm hush of nostalgia. But not the cabinet. It was set apart, sitting alone on a card table pushed into a dim corner of the living room. The wood was dark, aged in a way that suggested both care and sorrow. 2 small doors, brass hinges, hand-carved etchings of vines and grapes. A wine cabinet, the grandson called it. But no one else approached it. No one else touched it. And no one wanted to. Before we step deeper into this story, where are you watching from? The strange how far tales like this travel. The grandson, a man in his 30s with the tired expression of someone still navigating grief, warned visitors not to open it. He said his grandmother kept it hidden her entire life, that she insisted it never be touched, never be spoken of, and never be allowed to open again. When people asked why, he shrugged, said she believed it held a Dybbuk, a wandering spirit, a fragment of rage torn from someone who died too violently to rest. Most people laughed gently, the way people laugh when they don't want to offend a grieving family member. But laugh or not, no one opened the cabinet. No one tried, except one. His name was never recorded in any official register, but collectors on forums would later refer to him simply as the buyer. He was an antique shop owner, the kind of man who spent his weekends hunting for forgotten treasures with stories he could sell. He was level-headed, rational, and not the type to fear myths. But when he reached the table and laid his hand on the cabinet for the first time, something made him pause. The wood was warm, not warm like a piece sitting in sunlight, warm like a living hand that had just let go. He ran his fingers along the carvings. They were smooth but worn, as if countless hands had touched them before, not lovingly, but urgently, as if gripping the edges to keep it shut. He lifted it. The cabinet felt heavier than it should have, almost resistant, but he carried it to the register anyway. The grandson stepped forward then, a look of unsettled relief crossing his face. "Just so you know," he said, "she didn't want it opened, ever. She called it kashef, forbidden." The buyer smiled politely. "Superstitions," he said. The grandson didn't smile back. As the buyer walked out of the house, a wind kicked up across the porch. Something sharp and cold brushed the back of his neck. A small bite of November air. The trees rattled like bone chimes. He placed the cabinet in his trunk, shut it gently, and drove away. That night, the buyer placed the Dybbuk box on the kitchen table of his shop. He intended to clean it, restore it, list it for sale. It was routine work for him, nothing he hadn't done 100 times. But the moment he set the box down, something changed. The lights flickered. Not dramatically, just a quick, subtle pulse. The kind of flicker a house gives when it wants to remind you it's old. He checked the breaker. Nothing wrong. He walked back to the table, pulled out a soft cloth, and reached for the cabinet. That's when he heard it. A dull thud from inside. He froze. It wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive. Just a single, unmistakable knock from the inside of a cabinet that was supposed to be empty. He waited, listened. Silence. He placed his hand on the door. The wood was warmer than before, almost feverish. "Quick question. How did you find this story? Was it chance? Or something darker pulling you here?" The buyer shook off the unease. "Old wood shifts. Metal contracts. It's nothing," he told himself. He opened the cabinet. Inside were several objects wrapped carefully in faded cloth. A small granite slab with Hebrew letters carved faintly into its surface. A bundle of dried flowers, brittle and darkened. A golden goblet, dented. 2 locks of hair tied together with cord. And a candle holder stained with wax the color of rust. He examined each item, puzzled at the odd combination. They weren't valuable. They weren't even aesthetically interesting. They looked like the pieces of a ritual someone wanted desperately to bury. He lifted the granite slab. Underneath it, scratched into the wood, were deep gouges. Not accidental, not natural. Scratches made by fingernails. The room suddenly felt smaller. He repacked everything, shut the doors, and turned the lock. Then he carried the box downstairs to the shop's storage room and placed it on a metal shelf. Without touching a thing, every light in the basement flickered. Once, twice, and then one bulb near the far wall popped in a shower of sparks. The buyer stepped back. He wasn't frightened yet, but he was uneasy. The cabinet sat there in the half-dark, quiet, neutral, as if it hadn't reacted at all. He left it there overnight. The next morning, the shop became a different place. Customers came in complaining of headaches. Sharp, quick, sudden migraines that vanished the moment they stepped back outside. A delivery driver dropped a box of antique lamps and claimed he saw a figure in the stairwell. He couldn't describe it, only that it was standing too still. The buyer tried to ignore it, but the strangest moment came just after noon. He was pricing an old radio when a coldness spread across the room. It wasn't a gentle temperature shift. It was an isolated, unnatural pocket of cold, the kind that feels like someone breathing down your neck. He spun around. No one there, but the Dybbuk box sat on the counter. He stared. He hadn't moved it. No one else had keys to the basement. Dust on the shelf downstairs showed a clear outline where it had once rested. Now it was here, waiting, watching, silent. In that moment, the buyer felt something he couldn't explain. Not fear. Not exactly. More like being studied. He placed both hands on the counter and steadied his breath. Something about the room felt wrong. Subtly, deeply wrong. Like stepping into a church after someone whispered a curse inside it. A customer walked in then, smiling politely. She glanced at the counter, saw the wooden cabinet, and froze. "Where did you get that?" she whispered. "Estate sale," he answered. "Jewish family. Came from Europe during." "I know what it is," she said. Her voice cracked. "It's a prison. For something that doesn't want to be forgotten." And for the first time since he brought it home, the buyer felt the truth settle on him like frost. This wasn't just an antique. It wasn't just a superstition. It was a doorway, a containment, promise, and something inside had started to notice the world outside again. As the woman turned to leave the store, the lights flickered a final time. Longer now, slower, as if something was breathing through the wires. The buyer didn't say a word, didn't call after her, didn't even blink. He couldn't, because behind him, from the counter, came a soft, deliberate sound. 3 slow knocks, arcing across the wood, measured, intelligent, calling for someone, calling for him. If you've made it this far, you're already deeper than most. Subscribe before the next chapter finds you. Even among collectors of haunted objects, there is a quiet truth rarely spoken aloud. Curses don't arrive all at once. They slip in like a draft under the door. Subtle at first, almost polite. That's how the Dybbuk box began its work. The buyer tried to rationalize the knocks. Old wood, temperature change, air pressure. But as he locked up the shop that night, a sense of tension clung to him. Something like an unfinished sentence waiting for its final word. Outside, the sky had grown heavy with storm clouds, darkening early into an unnatural dusk. Streetlights buzzed faintly, struggling to push through the thickening fog. The buyer stepped onto the sidewalk and felt the chill settle across his skin, sharp and immediate. He paused, listening. A single thought slipped into his mind, uninvited. Take it home. He didn't know why he thought it, didn't know why he obeyed it. But within minutes, the Dybbuk box sat in the back seat of his car, swaddled in a blanket like a sleeping infant. The drive home was only 10 minutes, but those 10 minutes stretched in ways he couldn't explain. The radio flickered between stations without him touching the dials. Voices warbled and dissolved into static. A low hum vibrated through the steering wheel, rhythmic and pulsing, almost like a heartbeat. Before we go further, does this legend sound like something from your hometown? It's unsettling how many cursed objects begin with a simple purchase. He lived in a small house at the end of a quiet street, a craftsman-style home with warm, amber lighting and shelves filled with antiques. Normally it felt peaceful, safe. That night it didn't. The moment he carried the box through the front door, the air shifted. It wasn't colder. It wasn't warmer. Just heavier, as though the space between the walls contracted around him. He set the Dybbuk box on a coffee table, stood back, waited. Nothing. The house fell into a deep, unnatural silence, the kind of silence that makes your own breathing sound too loud. He moved slowly, turning on a few lights, trying to normalize the evening. He made tea, folded a few receipts, checked his email. All routine, all perfectly ordinary. And yet, every few minutes, his gaze drifted back to the cabinet, pulled like a compass needle to magnetic north. He decided to distract himself with work and went upstairs to sort through auction inventory. 15 minutes passed, maybe 20, then a sound, soft, indistinct, downstairs. He froze, listened, came again, not knocking this time, not scratching. It was something far more intimate, the creak of wood, as the cabinet door slowly opened on its own. His chest tightened, his throat went dry. He crept down the stairs one step at a time, each step bending under his weight. Halfway down, he saw it. The cabinet doors were open, wide open. The cloth-wrapped objects inside lay undisturbed, but the granite slab had shifted, slightly, angled, as if something beneath it had pressed upward. The buyer approached slowly, lungs tight with fear. He placed trembling fingers on the cabinet door. It was warm again, too warm, as if someone had been holding both doors from the inside moments before. If you were there that night, what would you have done? Because most people think they'd run. Most don't. He shut the cabinet, locked it, stepped back. The room darkened, just for a second. Every light in the house dimmed at once, a synchronized flicker that felt less like electrical interference and more like a blink. And for that single instant of darkness, he wasn't alone. He felt it behind him, standing close, watching. When the lights rose again, the room was empty. Of course it was. But emptiness felt like a lie. He grabbed a blanket, threw it over the entire cabinet, and retreated upstairs. Sleep didn't come easily, and when it finally did, it arrived in fragments, like memories from someone else's life. He dreamed of a dim cellar, a woman crying behind a locked door, claw marks on the wood, a voice whispering the same Hebrew word his grandmother once shouted in her sleep. Dybbuk, Dybbuk. He woke gasping, limbs shaking, shirt damp with cold sweat. The house was dead quiet, the kind of quiet that feels hostile. He crept down the stairs, dreading what he might see. The blanket lay on the floor. The cabinet door was open again. And on the table in front of it, though he had never placed it there, sat the granite slab turned face up like a warning. Its Hebrew letters were no longer faint in the morning light. They seemed darker now, as if freshly carved. He touched the edge of the slab. A cold shock shot through his palm, up his wrist, and into his shoulder, like static from a winter doorknob magnified 100-fold. He stumbled back. From somewhere inside the cabinet, a low breath exhaled. Long, slow, human. He froze. That breath had weight. It fogged the air. And then came a smell. Faint at first, then unmistakable. Burnt hair, old earth, and something metallic like dried blood on iron. He staggered out of the room, heart pounding, the kind of pulsing terror that erases logic. He didn't know what the box trapped, but whatever stirred inside it was waking with purpose. Do you think the spirit was cursed or chosen? Tell me below. I read every theory. He didn't call a priest, didn't call the police, didn't even call a friend. He did what people do in the sharpest moments of fear. He convinced himself it could still be explained. That's when the house phone started ringing. Not once, not twice, 6 times. The last ring was longer, distorted, as if the call had traveled through something thick, water, maybe, or smoke. He answered. Static spilled into his ear. Dark, wet, whispering underneath the noise like someone trying to speak through a mouthful of soil. He leaned closer. A woman's voice cracked through the static. Faint, strained. Don't open it. The line went dead. The buyer stood in the hall, shaking so violently he nearly dropped the phone. Behind him, the cabinet door creaked again. Not opening this time. Closing. Slowly. Firmly. As if something inside had just returned to its place. You've crossed into the part few dare to reach. Follow now before the story fades again. There are moments in every haunting when the line between coincidence and intention begins to blur. And once that line blurs, once it moves just a fraction, it never shifts back again. For the buyer, the unraveling didn't happen in a single catastrophic moment. It happened quietly, gradually, like threads coming loose from the edge of a well-worn garment, until the whole thing begins to fall apart in your hands. By the 3rd day, he hadn't slept more than a few scattered minutes at a time. Shadows tugged at the corners of his vision. He jumped at small noises, and he avoided the room where the Dybbuk box sat as though the air inside it were poisoned. But the box didn't avoid him. The morning after the strange phone call, he found something new in the hallway. A single, long strand of hair, curled on the hardwood floor, black, thick, coarse. He bent down and picked it up. The strand was cold, unnaturally cold, almost damp. He ran a hand through his own hair, checking for loose ends. Nothing. He placed the strand on the entryway table and walked into the living room. More hair. This time in a small cluster near the stairs, as though someone had dragged their fingers through their scalp and dropped whatever came loose. He collected it with shaking hands. More. A clump on his pillow. A long coil draped over the banister. He followed the trail slowly, dread rising with each step. He stopped at the cabinet. The buyer's breath hitched. He reached out, placed his palm on the cabinet door. Warm. Again. Almost pulsing. Before we step deeper, what does this story remind you of? It's unsettling how many legends begin with the smallest, most intimate details. That afternoon, he tried to clear his mind. Returned to the shop. Focused on normalcy. Tagging antiques, polishing brass lamps, repairing the cracked leather on an old armchair. But the shop felt changed. The entire building carried the faint scent of burnt herbs and old stone. The air felt thick, like stepping into a synagogue long after the congregation has gone home, where prayers hang in the air like invisible cobwebs. Customers wandered in and out, none staying long. Some complained of chills. Others said they felt watched. One woman stood near a display of vintage dolls, normally a bestseller, and suddenly burst into tears, staring at a point behind him. When he turned, nothing was there. At least nothing he could see. He closed the shop early. That night, he sat at his kitchen table, a cup of tea growing cold in his hands. The Dybbuk box sat across from him, blanketed, locked, silent. He stared at it like a man staring at a loaded gun. He needed answers. Not folklore. Not superstition. Answers. So he called the grandson from the estate sale. The man answered on the 2nd ring, sounding tired, guarded. Did something happen? He asked. The buyer hesitated. I just wanted to know more about the cabinet. A long silence. Then, I told you not to open it. I didn't, he lied. You did, the grandson said flatly. Because you wouldn't be calling me unless you did. The buyer's heart pounded. What was your grandmother afraid of? Another long silence. A sigh. She never talked about it directly. Not to me. But when she was very old, she told my mother a story from Poland. About a ritual. Something a group of women did during the war. The buyer listened closely. She said they trapped something. Something that was hunting them. Something that wore faces. but had none of its own. What kind of something? A Dybbuk, he whispered. They believed it had taken the spirit of a man who died violently. Someone filled with so much hatred that even death couldn't quiet him. The buyer swallowed. How did they trap it? She never said, the grandson replied. Just that it required sacrifice, binding, blood, and that the object holding it should never be opened, because whatever was locked inside was never meant to see another generation. The buyer closed his eyes. His entire house seemed to shift around him, settling deeper into the floor. Can you take it back? He asked. No, the man said, voice trembling now. And if you value your life, don't call this number again. The line went dead. The buyer sat motionless, heart pounding against his ribs. Silence filled the house. Then, from the living room, he heard it, a low, rhythmic thud. Not knocking, not shifting wood. Footsteps, slow, heavy, dragging. They moved from the wall, to the table, to the cabinet, then stopped, exactly where the Dybbuk box waited. Quick question. How did you find this story? Was it chance? Or something darker pulling you here? He didn't go to sleep that night. He couldn't. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw a cellar. A woman crying behind a wooden door. Claw marks on the frame. Shadows swarming behind her like smoke with intention. He stayed awake until sunrise. When the first light finally bled into the house, he forced himself to walk into the living room. The cabinet doors were open again. This time fully wide, gaping, like a mouth frozen mid-scream. Inside, something new rested atop the cloths. A photograph, old, black and white, edges burned. It showed a small group of women standing in a cramped room, their faces stern and hollow. One woman stood at the center, the same one from his dream. Her fingers wrapped around the edges of a wooden cabinet. The same cabinet. He flipped the photo over. On the back, in Hebrew, someone had written a single word. A name. He didn't recognize it. But it seemed wrong. Letters carved in haste. With fear. With desperation. Before he could process it, a sudden burst of cold air swept across the room. The cabinet doors slammed shut so violently the whole table shook. As the echo died, a whisper curled into the air, soft, raspy, barely audible. Not English, not Hebrew, something older, something hungry. The buyer staggered backward, clutching the photo as if it were a shield. He didn't know it yet, but he had just crossed a threshold no one, not even the women who trapped the spirit, had ever dared cross. He acknowledged it, named it, invited its attention. And once a Dybbuk knows your name, it never forgets. Don't go quiet yet. The next whisper in the dark is almost here. Every haunting has an origin point, a moment in history where darkness is given a name, a face, and a door to crawl through. For most cursed objects, that origin is blurred by time. Not the Dybbuk box. This origin is clear, sharp, violent. But to understand how the curse began, you must understand the woman at the center of it, the one whose trembling fingers carved the first warnings into the cabinet wood. Her name was Shava Lewin, and the buyer had just found her photograph. That morning, after the photo appeared inside the cabinet, the buyer did something he hadn't done since childhood. He prayed. Not the kind of prayer with words. Not the clean, organized kind people whisper in places of worship. This was instinctive, primitive, a silent plea to any force willing to listen. When he finally rose from his knees, exhausted, the house remained still, but not empty. The walls seemed to breathe around him, as though the structure was listening, waiting for him to move, to speak, to slip again. He placed the photograph on the dining table, studied the faces. The women, 5 of them, stood stiffly, expressions hollow, eyes cast slightly off camera as though something stood behind the photographer, something none of them wanted to look at directly. Shava stood in the center, her shoulders tensed, her hands gripping the cabinet so tightly her knuckles showed even in the faded image. And there was something else. Shadows. Thick, unnatural shadows gathered in the corner of the room behind her. Too heavy for candlelight, too defined to be coincidence. Shadows with shape, with curvature, with presence. Before we step deeper, ever heard whispers like this where you live? Some curses travel farther than their stories. The buyer needed answers, real ones, so he turned to the internet, forums, archives, diaspora records, Polish testimonies preserved in fragmented digital files, and buried among dozens of false leads and contradictory claims. He found a single reference, the Lewin ritual incident, 1941, an obscure entry in an underground resistance ledger written during the Nazi occupation of Poland. The document wasn't long, just a paragraph, but it mentioned Shava Lewin by name, and the phrase, the sealed cabinet. The buyer leaned closer, heart pounding. The translation was rough, pieced together from broken memories, but the meaning was clear enough. Lewin and the other women trapped the restless one, the broken spirit of a man who died cursing God and every living soul. They sealed him in a wine cabinet, a Dybbuk, a hateful fragment. We pray they succeeded. Hateful fragment. The words felt thick in his mouth. He scrolled. One more line, almost an afterthought. The room required blood to close. He closed the laptop, hands shaking. The house seemed to tighten around him again, like a predator closing its jaws. As he turned toward the living room, something caught his eye, a faint movement in the reflection of the hallway mirror. A shadow, human-shaped, standing behind him. He spun around. Nothing. But the temperature had dropped so sharply his breath fogged the air. A low hum vibrated through the floorboards, like a muffled voice speaking through earth. He stared toward the living room. The cabinet door was open again. He hadn't heard it open. This time it hadn't even creaked. It was just open, waiting. Quick question. How did you find this story? Was it chance? Or something darker pulling you here? He approached slowly, legs trembling, but there was something different this time. The air around the cabinet felt charged, almost electrical, as if a storm had gathered in the center of the room. A faint whisper shivered through the air. Then another, soft, stacked, layered, like many voices speaking over one another in a language he didn't understand. He leaned in. Inside the cabinet, under the granite slab and the dried flowers, lay something he had not seen before. Piece of wood. Splintered. Old. He lifted it carefully. It was part of a door. A cellar door. Claw marks raked across it. Long, frantic, desperate. And beneath the scratches, faint but unmistakable, more Hebrew letters. He held it under the lamp. The translation was simple but brutal. We held him here. He dropped the board onto the table. It landed with a heavy thud, and all at once the house reacted. Every light went out. The whole structure groaned. Wind howled outside, though the night was perfectly still. The buyer's breath caught. Darkness. Complete. Consuming. When the lights flickered back on, just for a fraction of a second, he saw her. The woman from the photo, Shava, standing in the corner of the room. Dress tattered. Face pale. Eyes sunken deeper than any living human's. And behind her, a mass of shifting darkness, shaped like a man but dissolving at the edges, as if made of smoke trapped inside a human mold. The lights snapped off again. He screamed. When the room lit again, she was gone. Only the cabinet remained, open, waiting, patient. He didn't know how long he stood there before his body allowed him to move. Minutes, hours. Time felt fractured, broken into unrecognizable shards. He crawled into the hallway, gripping the wall for balance. When he reached the bathroom, he flipped on the light and froze. In the mirror, faint but visible, words had been written across the glass. Letters formed with something dark and wet. Hebrew. He leaned closer, his breath fogging the glass. He translated slowly, dread curling into his spine. She died sealing him. You opened him. He staggered backward, knocking bottles to the floor. As the last word left his lips, a whisper drifted behind him, closer than his own shadow. A single word, spoken in a voice that was not wholly human. His name. Still here? Then you already feel it. The next part is closer than you think. If you study enough cursed objects, you'll notice a pattern. The deeper you dig into their history, the more the past begins to pull back. By the time the buyer reached the end of Chapter 4's nightmare, the Dybbuk box was no longer simply in his home. It was in his dreams, in his reflections, in the very architecture of his thoughts. And it had begun to show him things. Not hallucinations, no. That word implies randomness. These visions had purpose. They were memories, just not his. The morning after the mirror writing appeared, the buyer refused to touch the cabinet. He wouldn't go near it, wouldn't even step into the living room. Instead, he sat on the stairs, trembling, gripping the photo of Shava Lewin so tightly the edges curled under his fingers. He felt watched, not by one presence, by many. Whispers drifted through the house like distant drafts, too soft to decipher but too rhythmic to dismiss. He covered his ears. They slid beneath his palms. He played the radio. They hummed beneath the static. He slammed every door shut. Still they seeped through the cracks. Then, for the first time since the haunting began, a new voice cut through the others. Clear, sharp, desperate. A woman's voice. Please listen. The buyer froze. The house silenced instantly, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. Before we step deeper, what part of this tale gave you chills? Because every haunting has one moment where the ghost stops hiding. This was that moment. He turned slowly toward the living room doorway. There, standing beside the Dybbuk box, was the faint outline of Shava Lewin. Not fully formed, not solid. Her presence rippled like frost on a window pane, flickering between a woman and a memory of one. Her eyes, completely unlike the shadows he'd seen earlier, carried pain, but also purpose. And she wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the cabinet. The buyer stepped forward cautiously. What do you want from me? Chava's projection twitched, as though struggling against some invisible tension pulling at her. You opened it, she whispered. You must finish what we began. Her voice cracked, fragmented by a deeper static, as if something beneath her words was trying to drown her out. The shadows behind her pulsed. The buyer swallowed. Finish what? Her head turned, slowly, mechanically, like a puppet pulled by a trembling hand. The ritual. She faded. Not into the walls, not into the air. Into the cabinet. As though she had been tethered to it all along. The buyer's knees weakened. Sweat dripped down his neck. But he forced himself toward the table. He gripped the edges of the cabinet doors and opened them fully. Inside, the objects remained exactly as before. The granite slab, the dried flowers, the goblet, the braided locks of hair, the wax-stained candle holder, the wooden scrap from the cellar door. But they no longer looked random. There was a shape to the arrangement now, a ritual geometry emerging. The buyer reached for the granite slab. The moment his fingertips touched it, a flood of images slammed into his mind. He stood in a cellar, but not his cellar, Chava's. 5 women circled the cabinet. Shava was younger here, her hair longer, her face gaunt from war but fueled by determination sharper than fear. Candles flickered wildly, as though recoiling from something in the center of the circle. Shava spoke first, voice shaking but firm. He took Rivka's body last night. We cannot let him take another. The others nodded silently. Then came the breaking, the unbearable sound of something slamming against the cellar door behind them. A roar that was not human, not entirely animal. Something in between. A hybrid forged by grief, rage, and suffering. A shadow seeped beneath the doorframe like oily smoke. Shava raised the cabinet. The others lifted their hands, chanting words the buyer could not understand but felt deeply. The syllables vibrated through the very fabric of the room. The shadow writhed, twisted, then surged toward them. It hit with such force the candles went out. Darkness swallowed everything. The buyer felt it, felt the thing rush into the cabinet, felt the women slam the doors shut, felt fingernails tear into the wood as the Dybbuk tried to claw its way out, felt blood soak into the hinge grooves as the women, crying, chanting, holding the doors closed with their bodies, fought until the final syllable bound the spirit in place. And then, Shava collapsed, her blood pooling beneath the cabinet, her sacrifice sealing the ritual. The buyer gasped and ripped himself out of the vision. He stumbled backward, wheezing, eyes burning, hands shaking with primal terror. The cabinet door in the present creaked shut on its own, not violently but almost gently, respectfully. A whisper drifted from inside. "Finish it." The buyer sat at the table for hours, staring at the cabinet, trying to piece together the ritual. What did the granite slab signify? Were the flowers offerings? Were the braided locks remnants of the dead? Was the goblet meant to draw blood? Was the candle holder for summoning or banishing? He wrote everything down, cross-referenced Shava Lewin's records, searched Hebrew archives, folklore pages, mystical forums. He found fragments, incomplete, disjointed, contradictory. But one truth remained consistent. A Dybbuk cannot be freed, can only be transferred, moved, rebound. He ran a trembling hand across his face. Transferred to what? To whom? The whisper returned, closer this time, almost beside his ear. Not what? Who? He froze. A cold breath slid across his neck. Something was standing behind him. Slowly, painfully slowly, he turned. And there, inches from his face, stood a shadow the shape of a man, its edges rippling like smoke, its eyes hollow, bottomless pits of human suffering and inhuman hunger. The Dybbuk. It leaned close. When it spoke, its voice was layered, as though 100 souls were trapped inside the throat of one. You. The word vibrated through the room. You opened me. The house trembled. The lights flickered. Glass cracked. Wood bent. The cabinet door behind the shadow swung open, inviting, awaiting a transfer. No part of the buyer knew how to complete the ritual, but the Dybbuk did, and he wasn't asking. He was choosing. Only the curious make it this far, the next truth waits just beyond. There comes a point in every haunting when the house stops feeling like a home and becomes something else entirely. A vessel, a stage, a waiting mouth. By the time the Dybbuk revealed itself, the buyer's house had already shifted into that new shape. Every floorboard creaked with intention. Every shadow clung to corners as if listening. Even the air felt thicker, as though someone had filled the whole structure with water, slowing movement, distorting sound. And in that charged silence, the Dybbuk spoke its first command. You. Not a threat, not even a warning, a selection. As if the spirit had flipped through 1,000 possible outcomes and chosen him. Not at random, but with precision. The shadow loomed inches from the buyer's face, its form writhing like smoke wrestling with itself. It wasn't a simple ghostly silhouette. It had mass, the weight of a memory that refused to die. The buyer stumbled backward until his spine pressed against the wall, but the shadow didn't follow. It stood anchored to the cabinet, tethered by some invisible cord pulled taut inside the wood. The Dybbuk's form pulsed, shrinking, expanding, flickering, as though struggling against the boundaries of its confinement. You opened, it growled. The voice carried multiple tones, a single statement fractured into many, each echo chasing the other. You finish. Before we step deeper, does this legend sound like something from your hometown? Some rituals leave marks that never fade. The buyer forced himself to breathe, chest heaving in short, painful bursts. What do you want from me? He whispered. In response, the Dybbuk shifted shape, widening at the shoulders, narrowing at the waist, growing taller until its head nearly brushed the ceiling. Then, with slow deliberation, it raised one smoke-like arm and pointed to the objects inside the cabinet. The ritual pieces. One by one, they began to tremble. The granite slab shuddered. The candle holder rattled. The locks of braided hair lifted as if held by invisible fingers. The goblet slid forward, scraping across the wood with a metallic shriek. And beneath them all, the wooden cellar scrap, the only tangible relic of the original ritual, glowed faintly, as though absorbing light from a place beyond the room. The buyer stumbled closer, drawn by something he couldn't resist. The Dybbuk didn't move. It didn't need to. Every object on the table vibrated like a voice trying to speak, their combined hum forming a low, rhythmic pulse. A sequence. Pattern. A message. The buyer realized something then, something terrifying. The ritual wasn't random. It had steps, and the cabinet was guiding him. He closed his eyes, forcing himself to remember the visions Shava had shown him. The women chanting, the candles flickering, the Dybbuk thrashing against the cellar door, the blood, her collapse. He focused on the order of their movements, the positioning of their hands, the spacing between each object. The memory wasn't perfect, but it tugged at him, pulling him into alignment. He lifted the granite slab first. The house seemed to lean forward, listening. Then he placed the dried flowers beside it, arranging them in the same star-like pattern he'd glimpsed in Chava's memory. Next came the goblet, the hair, the candle holder. Each piece clicked into place with a subtle shift of air, as though the house exhaled approval. But when he reached for the wooden cellar scrap, the Dybbuk surged forward. Not fully, it couldn't, but enough that its form stretched like a dark wave reaching for him. The buyer froze. The Dybbuk's voice scraped through the air, colder than any winter wind. Blood. The slab glowed faintly beneath his fingers, and the buyer understood. The original ritual had required sacrifice, a piece of the living offered to bind the dead. His pulse pounded in his ears. "No," he whispered. "There has to be another way." From the corner of the room came the sound of something dragging across the floor, a long, heavy scrape that seemed to circle him slowly. He turned. Nothing there. Yet the sound persisted, moving behind him, around him, through him until it stopped at the cabinet. And then a whisper. Not the Dybbuk's. Chava's. "Do not let him choose you." Her voice trembled, fragmented by fear and distance. "You must bind him back. Before he binds you." The Dybbuk roared. A violent, shuddering burst of sound that rattled the windows and cracked one of the overhead lights. Chava's voice snapped off instantly, smothered by the shadow. The buyer dropped to the floor, covering his ears as the roar vibrated through the bones of the house. Plaster dust drifted from the ceiling like falling ash. When the noise finally ceased, the Dybbuk shrank back into the space between the doors, its shape twitching with fury. The granite slab pulsed again. The buyer stared at the objects, breath shaking. He understood the ritual's intention now. To bind a Dybbuk, you needed the relics of its past. You needed the blood of the present. And you needed a vessel, a literal body, to trap its hateful fragment. A host. The buyer looked to the cabinet. A host that wasn't him. He was shaking violently now. Sweat dripped from his palms. His vision blurred. His heartbeat stuttered. "Blood," the Dybbuk repeated, voice splitting in dozens of overlapping tones. The buyer grabbed the granite slab and hesitated only long enough to swallow his fear. Then he pressed his palm against the sharpened edge. A line of red trickled down his hand. The house responded instantly. Wind surged through the room, though every door and window remained shut. The cabinet vibrated violently. The candle holder burst into brief flame before extinguishing itself. The goblet rattled so hard it nearly tipped. The Dybbuk recoiled, hissing, smoke rippling away from the light that flickered within the ritual's formation. The buyer lifted his cut hand over the wooden cellar scrap. A single drop of blood fell. It hit the wood with a soft thud. Silence. Then, a sound rose from the cabinet. Not a whisper, not a roar, a scream, piercing, inhuman, wide enough to rattle the deepest part of a person's mind. The Dybbuk buckled violently, its form collapsing inward like something trying to resist being swallowed. The shadow's edges dissolved into thin, razor-sharp tendrils as the ritual's pull intensified. The buyer stepped back, shielding his face from the lashing smoke. He didn't know if he had begun the ritual correctly. He didn't know if he had made it worse. He only knew one thing. He had chosen, and the Dybbuk had felt the choice. Don't close the page yet. The legend isn't finished with you. The night did not end. Could not. Not after the ritual, not after the scream. The house had absorbed it all, and in return, it had awakened something older, hungrier, beyond the grasp of reason. The buyer lay on the floor, hands still bleeding, heart hammering, ears ringing with the aftershock of a sound that should not exist. He dared not move. He dared not breathe. The room felt impossibly small, as though the walls themselves had thickened, encroaching with deliberate patience. And then the subtle shift, a whisper at the edge of hearing, soft, teasing, a voice that was not Shava yet somehow familiar. Do you feel it? Do you understand? The Dybbuk had not fled. It had not surrendered. It had simply changed shape, retreating into a form that lurked in every shadow, whispered in every draft, and pressed against the very air like invisible fingers tracing the edges of a living mind. The objects on the table began to vibrate again, though this time the rhythm was different. Irregular, chaotic, threatening. The granite slab throbbed like a pulse, responding to some force beyond the room, beyond comprehension. The candle holder twisted, bent unnaturally, its wax spilling in patterns that suggested language, geometry, a map of intent. The buyer forced himself upright. Each movement was agony. The blood on his hands seemed to burn through his skin, leaving trails of fire along the veins. He looked at the cabinet. The Dybbuk's shadow flickered across the edges of the doors like smoke trying to escape a bottle. You think it over? The voice hissed, overlapping, splitting, echoing in multiple directions at once. You think to contain what cannot be contained? A chill crawled along his spine. It was not the cold of the room, not the chill of winter. It was the cold of memory, of centuries of resentment, of curses formed long before his kind walked the earth. The Dybbuk was not merely a spirit. It was a ledger of vengeance, a record of unhealed grievances, a force that waited for each opening with the patience of stone. The buyer realized something then. The ritual had not ended. No, the ritual had merely begun. The single drop of blood had acted as a key, a spark, a turning of a lock that no mortal hand should have touched. And in that moment, the Dybbuk shifted fully. Not a shadow now, not a flicker of smoke, but something solid. A figure that crouched on the table like a living nightmare, eyes coals in a hollow skull, hands tipped with the blackened remnants of fire. It moved, slowly, calculated, every step measured, deliberate. The house itself seemed to bend with it, guiding it closer, shaping hallways, elongating shadows, whispering to the furniture, the floorboards, the very air to obey its will. The buyer backed away, clutching the granite slab like a talisman, chanting words he did not remember learning. Not prayers, not commands, but instinctual murmurs, pulled from some hidden part of the mind that had been touched by the same darkness that lingered in the cabinet. The Dybbuk reached toward the wooden cellar scrap. Its fingers brushed the edges of the relic, and for a heartbeat, the objects on the table all shivered simultaneously, emitting a vibration that was felt, not heard, rattling teeth and bones alike. Blood binds. Blood awakens. Blood chooses. The words burned through his skull. The buyer understood with sudden clarity that this was no longer a question of containment. He was not simply a participant in the ritual. He was a pivot point. The Dybbuk did not merely occupy space. It occupied intention, and intention, left unchecked, could reshape reality. Desperation flooded him. He remembered Chava's warning. You must bind it back before it binds you. And yet, how could one man, one fragile human, counteract a force that had twisted the fates of all who had touched it before? The answer came not from logic, but from instinct, from fear, from the primal recognition that the Dybbuk's essence was not uniform, it was fractured. Shards of a spirit, each anchored in pain, anger, and unfinished business. If he could redirect its fragments, isolate them, trap them in sequence, he moved. Hands shaking violently, he lifted the granite slab, adjusted the candle holder, repositioned the goblet, and laid the locks of hair in a pattern dictated not by memory, but by a subconscious understanding of symmetry, order, and intent. The Dybbuk hissed. The air thickened, pressing against his lungs. Shadows lengthened, reaching, grasping, clawing at the edges of his vision. Yet, the pulse of the ritual beneath his fingers grew stronger, steadier, more certain. A whisper came again, Chava's voice, clearer this time. Do not falter. One fragment at a time. One will lead to another. Bind them. Bind yourself. He obeyed. Every breath, every motion, every heartbeat was measured, precise. Sweat burned his eyes, blood dripped from the slab, and the room convulsed in anticipation. And then the first fragment screamed. Not a scream of pain, but of recognition. A shard of the Dybbuk recoiled, pulled toward the center of the ritual, its essence folding inward, twisting like smoke caught in a vortex. One by one, the fragments were drawn together, writhing, struggling, until they coalesced above the wooden cellar scrap, contained, compressed, bound, though tenuously, and for now. The buyer fell to his knees, shaking, gasping, aware that he had merely survived the first stage. The Dybbuk was bound, yes, but not subdued. The house itself was watching, waiting for the next weakness, the next misstep, the next heartbeat to falter. And in the corner of the room, where shadows pooled, the faintest trace of smoke twined around the cabinet handles, a warning unspoken. This is not over. It will awaken again. Pause, slow exhale, whispering tone. Some curses, dear listener, are eternal. Some spirits do not forgive. And some choices, once made, cannot be undone. Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to hold a Dybbuk's gaze? To make a choice that even spirits envy? If you dare, continue to the final chapter. The night had not ended. Not truly. Not after the fragments of the Dybbuk had been drawn together, trembling like captured shadows above the wooden cellar scrap. The house itself seemed to exhale, a slow, deliberate pulse that rattled the windows and set the floorboards humming beneath the buyer's trembling feet. He knelt, hands slick with blood, staring at the ritual's center. Each fragment writhed, resisting, whispering, protesting in voices older than any memory he possessed. He could feel them pressing against the air, against the walls, even against his chest, as though the house had become a living, sentient thing, and he, a single, fragile heartbeat in its vast, dark body. Bind, bind, bind. The whispers chanted in overlapping tongues, a chorus of menace and longing. The buyer's vision blurred, the edges of reality warping, folding. The candle flames stretched unnaturally, reaching toward the ceiling as if to escape. Shadows danced on the walls, not in reflection of light, but in imitation of intent, twisting into grotesque shapes, faces he didn't recognize, screaming in silence. He remembered Chava's voice, clear and insistent in his mind. One more step, the final binding. Only one will contain it, only one host. And then, realization, the Dybbuk needed a vessel. Not a fragment, not a temporary cage. A body, living and willing, or at least present enough for its essence to anchor. And the house. The box had selected one. He turned slowly toward the cabinet. Its surface was darker than before, shadows pooling along the edges, writhing, alive. And in that darkness, he saw it, the Dybbuk itself, rising, stretching into its full form, taller than any human, wider than any doorway, its smoke-like appendages lashing the walls as if testing their endurance. Its eyes burned like coals, hollow yet intelligent, ancient yet personal. Every instinct screamed for flight. Every rational thought begged him to run. But the ritual demanded obedience, and he was already too far entwined to escape. He lifted the granite slab again, placing it precisely above the wooden cellar scrap. The fragments writhed, twisting into themselves, seeking, searching, until they aligned perfectly with the objects around them. The hair, the goblet, the candle holder, the dried flowers, each piece vibrating in harmony. The Dybbuk shrieked, a sound that split the air like lightning, shaking teeth, rattling skulls, and filling every corner of the house with ancient fury. The lights flickered, overhead beams trembling, dust raining from the ceiling. And yet, the fragments moved willingly now, drawn into the formation like moths to fire. A final step remained. One drop of blood was no longer sufficient. The host must offer more. Heart, mind, body, an anchor strong enough to contain this spirit. The buyer's hand hovered above the slab, quivering. Sweat burned his eyes. He tasted iron on his lips. And then he pressed the edge of the slab against his own forearm, letting the essence of life flow into the ritual, into the fragments, into the very wood that had trapped so much anger and pain. The Dybbuk screamed, not a scream of rage, not a scream of fear, but a scream of recognition. A scream of being caught, of being forced to respect the law of binding once again. Shadows converged on themselves, spinning into a vortex of smoke, light, and sound. The room shook, walls groaning, the ceiling threatening to collapse. Yet the formation held. The ritual had reached its crescendo. And then, silence. The kind of silence that suffocates, that presses against your chest, that makes you feel the absence of all sound, all life, all motion. The Dybbuk had been bound, anchored, contained within the vessel, within the objects, within the ritual. But it was still there, waiting, patient, eternal. The buyer collapsed to the floor, trembling, gasping. His arms were raw. His mind teetered between delirium and clarity. He had survived. The Dybbuk was no longer free to wreak chaos, at least not completely. And yet, the knowledge lingered, heavy and dark. The spirit never forgives. It waits. It learns. It remembers. Do not open. Do not touch. Do not invite me again. The house breathed once more, settling into stillness. Shadows receded into corners. The air thinned, and a calm descended, fragile as glass. The objects remained on the table, inert, yet humming faintly with the echo of what had just occurred. The buyer staggered to the cabinet, hands shaking, and closed the doors. The Dybbuk was inside, contained, silent, but not gone. He left the room. He left the house. He left the city. And yet, as he walked into sunlight, he could feel the weight of the ritual, of the spirit, of the centuries of vengeance that had been bound but never destroyed. The Dybbuk box remained, waiting, watching, patient, and for anyone who dared to open it again, the story would begin anew. CTA soft, haunting tone. Do you dare imagine the cost of curiosity? Would you lift the lid if it called your name? Remember, dear listener, some choices cannot be undone, and some legends are eternal.